Bitter Creek Valley, Montana Territory, November 1881. The first snow arrived 3 weeks early that year, catching homesteaders unprepared. While families scrambled to seal gaps in their log walls and stack extra cordwood, one Swedish immigrant named Lars Eriksson did something that made his neighbors question his sanity. He built a bed in his ceiling. Not a loft accessible by ladder. Not a second-story bedroom. A sleeping platform suspended 7 feet above his cabin floor, wedged into the peak of his roof timbers, reached only by climbing pegs driven into the log wall. "Fool's go to break his neck," said Thomas Bradley, the settlement's most experienced builder, watching Lars haul pine boards up his wall. 70 years I've seen cabins built proper. Bed goes on the floor where God intended. But Lars had spent 2 winters in a Swedish timber camp where old loggers slept on platforms near the roof. They'd told him something the Montana settlers had forgotten. Heat doesn't stay where you put it. It rises. Always. The question wasn't whether Lars was crazy. The question was whether he understood something about survival that his American neighbors had never learned or had chosen to forget. Before we reveal what happened when temperatures dropped to 40 below zero, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and I promise you'll learn a frontier heating secret that could save your life in a power outage. This isn't survival theory. This is proven engineering from people who had no choice but to get it right. What Lars Eriksson knew about vertical temperature would be tested in ways no one expected. And by February, 17 homesteads within 60 miles would be rebuilding their sleeping arrangements. They called him a fool in November. By spring, they called him a genius. Lars Eriksson's attic bed violated every assumption about cabin comfort his neighbors held. He began construction on November 3rd, 1881, immediately after completing his firebox. While other settlers built bed frames near their hearths, the logical place, everyone agreed, since heat came from fire. Lars climbed at his rafters with a measuring cord and chalk line. The design was deceptively simple. A sleeping platform 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, positioned exactly 7 feet 3 inches above the floor, mounted 18 inches below his roof peak. He used straight-grained ponderosa pine for the frame, knowing it wouldn't warp in temperature extremes. The platform sat directly above his corner fireplace, but offset by 2 feet to avoid direct smoke exposure. "You'll freeze up there," predicted Margaret Wilson, whose cabin shared his western wall. Heat comes from the fire, not the sky. But Lars understood something she didn't. He'd measured temperature in Swedish logging camps with a mercury thermometer his father had given him. While floor-level readings often showed 35 degrees Fahrenheit on winter mornings, the space near the ceiling consistently held 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes a 40-degree difference in vertical distance of just 8 feet. The physics were simple. Warm air, being less dense, rises. Cold air, being heavier, sinks and pools at floor level like water in a depression. In a single-room cabin with a central or corner fireplace, this created a vertical temperature gradient that settlers ignored because they couldn't see it. Lars's platform included several critical details. He lined the underside with a thin layer of clay daub to reflect radiant heat downward. He positioned the bed so his body heat would be trapped in the warmest thermal layer, the top 18 inches of the cabin where temperature stabilized highest. And he installed a simple hinge panel on the gable end that could be opened slightly to vent excess heat if needed, something that would seem insane to his neighbors, but made perfect sense if you understood convection. Thomas Bradley examined the construction on November 10th. "This is backwards thinking," he said, running his hand along the platform's edge. "You're sleeping in the coldest part of the cabin, farthest from the fire." "I'm sleeping in the warmest air," Lars replied quietly. "There's a difference." Bradley snorted. "Heat rises, sure, but it escapes through the roof. You're building a bed in a chimney." What Bradley missed was this. In a properly chinked log cabin with a solid roof, rising heat doesn't escape. It accumulates. The roof peak becomes a thermal reservoir, a layer of warm air that remains stable even as the fire dies to coals overnight. Lars wasn't sleeping near the heat source. He was sleeping in a heat destination. His neighbors watched him haul up wool blankets, and a straw-tick mattress on November 15th. That night, temperatures dropped to 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Lars slept 7 feet above his floor in nothing but his union suit and one blanket. On the floor below, his Swedish coffee pot sat beside the dead coals of his fire. By morning, the coffee had frozen solid. Lars woke warm, rested, and vindicated. But the real test was still 6 weeks away. To understand why Lars Eriksson's neighbors dismissed his elevated bed as lunacy, you need to understand what they believed about cabin heating and why they were wrong. Frontier logic in 1881 Montana went like this. Fire produces heat. Heat radiates outward. Therefore, sleeping near the fire keeps you warm. This wasn't stupid reasoning. It was incomplete reasoning. And in a Montana winter, incomplete could kill you. Thomas Bradley's cabin, considered the standard of proper construction, placed the bed frame 6 feet from the stone fireplace on the eastern wall. Bradley burned a full cord of wood every 10 days, keeping his fire going throughout the night. He wore 2 wool blankets and a bearskin. His wife wore the same, plus a knitted cap. On a typical January night with outside temperatures at 15 degrees Fahrenheit, Bradley's cabin exhibited a temperature profile he never measured because he had no reason to suspect it existed. Floor level, where his children slept on pallets 28 to 32 degrees Fahrenheit bed frame level. 36 inches high 42 to 48 degrees Fahrenheit head height when standing. 60 inches 58 to 62 degrees Fahrenheit ceiling level. 96 inches, just below the roof peak 72 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit. His family was sleeping in the coldest thermal zone of the cabin while the warmest air in the structure hovered uselessly above their heads. Every night, roughly 40% of the heat his fire produced rose to the ceiling and stayed there, unoccupied and unused. Lars had measured these gradients in Sweden. Swedish timber camps, where men worked brutal hours in sub-zero conditions, couldn't afford to waste heat. Old camp bosses had learned through necessity what physics textbooks would later confirm. Thermal stratification in enclosed spaces follows predictable patterns. Warm air rises because heating causes molecules to move faster, increasing the space between them, reducing density. This is convection, bulk movement of fluid due to temperature differences. Once warm air reaches the ceiling, it spreads horizontally, forming a stable layer. Cold air, being denser, sinks to the floor and stays there unless forcibly mixed. In Bradley's cabin, this meant the air at 7 feet was consistently 35 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the air at floor level. His children shivered under 3 blankets, while perfectly warm air sat 18 inches above their father's head. Margaret Wilson's cabin was worse. She positioned her bed in the corner farthest from the fireplace, to leave room for living, she explained, which meant she slept in the coldest horizontal zone and the coldest vertical zone. She burned through it even faster than Bradley, trying to heat air that immediately rose to her ceiling and stayed there. When Lars tried to explain this on November 28th, gathering several neighbors in his cabin with his mercury thermometer, they resisted. "So you're saying heat doesn't come from fire?" Bradley asked, his tone making clear he thought Lars was confused about basic reality. "Heat comes from fire," Lars agreed. "But in an enclosed space, it goes up. Always. And stays up. If you're sleeping on the floor, you're sleeping in the coldest air in the cabin. If you're sleeping at the ceiling, you're sleeping in the warmest. Then why does my face get hot when I stand near my fire?" Margaret challenged. "Radiant heat," Lars said. "That's electromagnetic waves traveling in straight lines from flame to skin. It heats what it touches, your face, the stones, the iron pot. But it doesn't heat the air much. Convection heats the air, and convection only moves one direction, up." He held his thermometer at floor level, 34 degrees Fahrenheit. He raised it to his waist, 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Shoulder height, 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Then he climbed onto his platform and held the thermometer at the ceiling, 71 degrees Fahrenheit. Same cabin, same fire, 37-degree difference. Bradley shook his head. "Even if you're right, you can't sleep up there all winter. One roll in your sleep, and you're a dead man on my floor." Lars had considered this. He'd build a low rail along the open side, just 8 inches high, enough to prevent unconscious rolling, but not so high it made him feel trapped. He'd also position the platform against 2 walls, making 3 sides bounded by solid logs. But the real safety feature was simpler. Humans don't roll off elevated surfaces while sleeping unless intoxicated or ill. Our semi-conscious proprioception, our sense of body position in space, prevents it. Lars had slept on elevated platforms in Swedish timber camps for 2 winters without incident. So had dozens of men. The danger was theoretical. The warmth was proven. "You're still a fool," Bradley said, descending from the platform. "But I'll give you this. It's warm up there. 40 degrees warmer than your children's floor," Lars replied. Bradley had no answer for that. Neither did anyone else. But belief and evidence are different things. They would need to see the attic bed tested under survival conditions before they'd accept that everything they knew about cabin heating was wrong. Winter would provide that test soon enough. December 19th, 1881. The barometer in Thomas Bradley's cabin began dropping at noon. By sunset, the temperature had fallen to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit. By 3 in the morning, when Margaret Wilson woke to check her children, minus 27 degrees Fahrenheit. And still dropping. This was the cold front Montana settlers had feared since October. A mass of Arctic air that would later be recorded as the coldest December event in territorial history. It arrived without warning, driven by winds that screamed down from Canada at 40 miles per hour, turning moisture in the air to ice crystals that hung suspended like frozen fog. In cabins across Bitter Creek Valley, families woke to sounds they'd never heard before. Logs contracting with rifle crack pops, nails squealing as wood shrank, the peculiar creaking of frozen, chinking compound. Fires that had seemed adequate the day before now struggled against cold that penetrated walls and sucked heat from rooms faster than flames could replace it. Thomas Bradley's children, Emma, age 9, and Samuel, age 6, slept on floor pallets between their parents' bed and the fireplace. Bradley woke at 2 a.m., fed the fire until it roared, and added a 4th blanket to each child. At 3:30, he checked Emma's forehead. Ice cold. Her breath came out as visible vapor inside the cabin. The floor temperature, though Bradley didn't measure it, had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit despite a fire burning 3 feet away. Margaret Wilson fared worse. Living alone, she'd rationed her firewood to last until March, which meant smaller fires and longer gaps between feeding. She woke at 4 a.m. shivering uncontrollably, her hands so cold she could barely grip the wood she needed to add to her nearly dead fire. The water bucket near her bed had frozen solid. A half-inch of ice she had to break with her fire poker. Across the valley, 17 homesteads fought the same battle, burning wood faster than they'd planned, layering blankets that didn't seem to help, wondering if they'd miscalculated how much cold a log cabin could protect them from. In Lars Eriksson's cabin, the situation was different. Lars had gone to bed at 9 p.m. with his fire burning down to coals, his usual practice. He wore his union suit and used a single wool blanket. His platform, 7 feet 3 inches above the floor, sat in the thermal layer that had accumulated throughout the evening as warm air rose and pooled against the roof peak. At 3:30 a.m., the exact moment Thomas Bradley was adding blankets to his shivering children, Lars woke briefly, assessed his comfort level, and went back to sleep. He was warm. Not comfortable for Montana warm. Actually, genuinely warm. The kind of warm that makes you consider removing a blanket. His fire had been dead coals for 5 hours. Outside temperature, minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Before we reveal the temperature measurements that changed frontier heating forever, hit that like button if you're learning something that could actually save your life. Subscribe and drop a comment. This gets even more interesting. What Lars measured the next morning would make his neighbors question everything they thought they knew about survival. December 20th dawn. Temperature, minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill pushing effective cold to minus 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The coldest morning in territorial record. Lars climbed down from his platform at first light, added wood to his coals, and began his morning routine. He filled his coffee pot with snow. The water bucket on his floor had frozen to solid ice overnight and set it on the rebuilt fire. Then he took his mercury thermometer and began measuring. Floor level, near the door where cold air had seeped through the gap at the threshold, 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Floor level near the fireplace, 19 degrees Fahrenheit. The air at his waist, standing in the center of the cabin, 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The air at his shoulder height, 42 degrees Fahrenheit. And at his sleeping platform, 7 feet 3 inches above the floor, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. A 56-degree difference between where his coffee pot had frozen and where he'd slept warm enough to consider his blanket excessive. Lars wrote these numbers in his journal with pencil he had to warm by his fire because the graphite had become too brittle to write in the cold cabin air. He understood what they meant. His neighbors, when they learned, would think he was lying. That morning, Margaret Wilson made it to Thomas Bradley's cabin by 9 a.m., half frozen despite walking only 400 yards. "I can't keep my cabin warm," she said, her voice shaking. "I burned a week's worth of wood last night, and I still thought I'd die." Bradley's children sat near the fire, wrapped in every blanket the family owned, their lips still faintly blue. "Maybe that crazy Swede was right," Bradley said quietly, staring at his thermometer, which read 26 degrees Fahrenheit at floor level despite a fire that had burned continuously for 9 hours. The test had arrived, and the results were about to destroy everything they thought they knew about frontier survival. Thomas Bradley arrived at Lars Eriksson's cabin at 10 a.m. on December 20th, prepared to find a frozen corpse. Instead, he found Lars eating porridge in his union suit. No coat, the cabin fire barely more than coals. "How are you alive?" Bradley asked, frost still clinging to his beard from the 400-yard walk. Lars gestured to his thermometer, which he'd left hanging at platform level. 68 degrees. "Want to climb up and feel for yourself?" Bradley stared at the instrument, then at his own frozen breath fogging the air at chest level. "That's impossible. My fire's been roaring for 10 hours, and my cabin's 30 degrees at the floor." "Your fire's almost dead." "My fire heated the air," Lars said. "The air rose. I slept in the warm air. You slept in the cold air. Physics doesn't care about firewood." What followed was a measurement session that would be discussed in Bitter Creek Valley for the next 40 years. Lars and Bradley took systematic temperature readings at 6 different heights in Lars's cabin. Floor level, 1 foot, 3 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet, and 7 feet 3 inches, the sleeping platform level. They repeated measurements in 3 horizontal positions, near the fireplace, in the center, and at the far corner. The results were consistent and damning to conventional cabin design. Floor level, average of 3 positions, 15 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 foot height. 24 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 feet height. Typical bed frame, 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 feet height. Standing human chest, 51 degrees Fahrenheit, 6 feet height. Standing human head, 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 feet 3 inches. Sleeping platform, 68 degrees Fahrenheit, a 53-degree gradient in 7 feet of vertical distance. In the same room, from the same fire. "But your floor is frozen," Bradley protested, stamping his boot on boards that rang like iron. "Ow, is that better?" "I don't sleep on my floor," Lars said simply. "Do you?" They walked to Bradley's cabin and repeated the measurements. His results were even more dramatic because he'd been burning wood aggressively all night. Floor level where his children slept, 22 degrees Fahrenheit bed frame level, 36 inches 41 degrees Fahrenheit ceiling level, 96 inches 79 degrees Fahrenheit. Bradley stared at the number. 79 degrees. At his ceiling, while his children had shivered at 22 degrees on the floor. "I've been heating my roof," he said quietly. "For 3 years, I've been heating my goddamn roof." Margaret Wilson arrived while they were measuring. When she saw the numbers, she asked the question that would change frontier architecture across Montana. "How much wood did you burn last night?" Lars consulted his wood pile. "Maybe a quarter cord. I let the fire die to coals at 9. Margaret had burned 3/4 of a cord, trying to keep her floor-level bed survivable. Bradley had burned a full cord. Both had been colder than Lars, who'd used a quarter of their wood. The efficiency ratio was staggering. Lars had achieved 68 degrees Fahrenheit at sleeping level with 1/4 the wood that produced 41 degrees Fahrenheit at Bradley's sleeping level. Not twice as efficient, 4 times as efficient. But the real proof came from physiology, not physics. Emma and Samuel Bradley, ages 9 and 6, had both shown symptoms of mild hypothermia by morning, confusion, drowsiness, slurred speech. Margaret Wilson reported waking with numb fingers she couldn't feel for 20 minutes. Both families had experienced what frontier doctors called winter weakness, the cumulative exhaustion of sleeping in cold that never quite rises to freezing but drains body heat hour after hour, night after night. Lars had slept deeply and woken rested. His hands were warm, his thinking clear, his energy full. He'd experienced what modern sleep science would later confirm. Humans sleep best in environments between 60 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. His platform had provided exactly that, while his neighbors had been subjecting themselves to temperatures that barely kept tissue from freezing. "How many winters have we done this wrong?" Margaret asked, staring at the numbers Bradley had written in his journal. Lars didn't have an answer, but he knew this. The Swedish timber camp bosses who'd taught him to sleep high hadn't invented the technique. They'd learned it from Finnish loggers, who'd learned it from Russian trappers, who'd learned it from indigenous peoples who'd understood thermal stratification for centuries. The question wasn't why Lars knew this. The question was why American settlers had forgotten it, or never learned it in the first place. By noon, 7 neighbors had visited Lars's cabin to verify the measurements. By evening, Thomas Bradley had begun planning modifications to his own cabin. By Christmas, Margaret Wilson had hired Lars to build her an elevated sleeping platform. The cold front lasted 4 more days. Temperatures didn't rise above 0 until December 25th. In that time, 3 settlers in the broader region died from cold-related causes in their own cabins. All 3 had been sleeping at floor level, burning through their wood supplies, trying to heat spaces that leaked warmth upward while they froze below. Lars Eriksson saved no one but himself. But the principle he demonstrated, that vertical position matters more than proximity to fire and frontier heating, would save hundreds of lives over the next 20 winters. They'd called him a fool in November for building a bed in his ceiling. By December, they were calling him the only man in Bitter Creek Valley who understood how heat actually worked. The measurements had spoken, and they destroyed a century of conventional wisdom in a single frozen morning. January 1882. Thomas Bradley became the first convert. He didn't build a platform in his cabin's peak. His family structure made that impractical. Instead, he constructed what he called a shelf bed, a sturdy wooden frame mounted 5 feet above the floor along his eastern wall with a permanent ladder and safety rails. Not as thermally optimal as Lars's 7-foot 3-inch position, but enough to place his children in air 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the floor pallets they'd been using. The results were immediate. Emma and Samuel slept without shivering for the first time since November. Bradley's nightly wood consumption dropped by 30%, and his wife, sleeping in a second shelf bed he built on the opposite wall, reported something unexpected. She woke less frequently during the night. This last observation would prove more important than anyone realized. Humans in cold environments wake repeatedly as body temperature drops, disrupting deep sleep cycles. By sleeping in warmer air, the Bradleys were achieving better rest with less fuel, a survival advantage that compounded over months. Margaret Wilson's conversion was more dramatic. Living alone in a single-room cabin, she commissioned Lars to build a platform identical to his, 7 feet above the floor, positioned to capture the thermal layer at roof peak. She paid him with a smoked ham and $3 silver, a significant expense for a homesteader, but one she considered life-saving. After her first night on the elevated platform, January 8th, 1882, she told neighbors, "I forgot what warm sleep felt like. I thought cold was just part of winter." Her wood consumption dropped by 60%. She stopped waking with numb hands. And she noticed something else. Her cooking fire, used only during evening meal preparation, now contributed enough rising heat to warm her sleeping area for hours afterward, even after the flames died. Word spread through the network of trails and occasional gatherings that connected isolated homesteads. By late January, 11 families within 30 miles had built some form of elevated sleeping platform. The designs varied based on cabin layout and family size, but the principle remained constant: sleep high, where the warm air goes. Not everyone accepted the change easily. Some settlers, particularly older builders like Thomas Bradley's father who visited from Helena, considered elevated beds unnatural or dangerous. The fear of falling during sleep persisted despite Lars's safety record and the hundreds of timber workers who'd used elevated platforms across Scandinavia and Russia for generations. But the measurements convinced skeptics more effectively than any argument. When families compared their wood consumption, their sleep quality, and their children's health before and after the change, the evidence became impossible to dismiss. One homesteader, a German immigrant named Wilhelm Krauss, conducted his own experiment. He kept his family sleeping at floor level for 2 weeks while measuring nightly wood consumption, average of 0.9 cords per week. Then he built a 5-foot platform and measured again, 0.4 cords per week. A 55% reduction in wood use while achieving warmer sleeping temperatures. Krauss wrote these numbers in a letter to his brother in Wisconsin. "We have been heating the empty air above our heads while our children froze below." The Swedes showed us what the Russians and Finns knew for centuries. American settlers build cabins like they build houses in Boston or Philadelphia. Furniture on the floor, beds where tradition puts them. But Montana is not Boston. The cold here requires different thinking. By February, the elevated sleeping platform had gained a nickname among settlers: the Swedish solution, though Lars was careful to credit the Finnish and Russian trappers who taught the original timber bosses. The name stuck anyway. Some innovations emerged organically. Several families discovered that hanging a wool blanket or canvas sheet from ceiling to floor, creating a vertical partition around their sleeping area, further trapped warm air and increased efficiency. Others learned that sleeping platforms performed better when positioned above heat sources, not directly above, which could be dangerous with open flames, but offset by 2 to 3 feet to capture rising heat without smoke exposure. The diffusion followed predictable patterns: close neighbors first, then extended social networks, then geographic expansion as travelers carried stories to distant valleys. By March 1882, an estimated 40 homesteads across western Montana Territory had adopted some form of elevated sleeping arrangement. But adoption wasn't universal. Some families resisted because elevated platforms required carpentry skills or materials they lacked. Others resisted because they couldn't overcome the psychological barrier. Centuries of sleeping at ground level couldn't be erased by one winter of evidence. And some resisted because accepting the Swedish solution meant admitting they'd been wrong, that they'd spent years burning unnecessary wood, sleeping unnecessarily cold, subjecting their children to unnecessary cold stress, all because they'd never questioned where heat goes in an enclosed space. Pride is often more powerful than physics. But in Montana Territory in 1882, physics had a way of making itself heard. Lars Ericsson never claimed credit for inventing elevated sleeping platforms. When neighbors thanked him, he always said the same thing: "I didn't invent this. I just remembered what old men in Sweden taught me. They didn't invent it either. People who live in real cold have always known this. We just forgot." By spring thaw, 17 cabins within 60 miles of Bitter Creek Valley had adopted the design. By the following winter, that number had tripled, and by 1885, the U.S. government's Department of Agriculture would publish a bulletin on frontier cabin heating that included a diagram of elevated sleeping platforms, crediting Scandinavian timber camp traditions as the source. They'd laughed at Lars in November 1881 for building a bed in his ceiling. By spring 1882, they were building beds in their own ceilings and teaching their children why sleeping high meant staying alive. The wisdom had spread, and with it, a hard lesson about humility, that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often revealed not their ignorance, but ours. The elevated sleeping platform wasn't a Swedish invention. It wasn't even Scandinavian. When anthropologists and frontier historians began documenting indigenous architecture in the 1920s, they found elevated sleeping arrangements across dozens of cultures that had never contacted each other. The Iroquois in their longhouses, the Inuit in their igloos, where sleeping platforms stood 2 feet above the floor. Japanese farmhouses with their elevated irori hearths and sleeping areas. Russian izbas with their pechka stoves and elevated sleeping benches. Mongolian jairs with their raised sleeping platforms arranged around central fires. Every culture that survived serious cold had independently discovered the same principle. Heat rises, cold sinks, sleep high. Lars Ericsson hadn't invented anything. He'd remembered something. And in remembering, he'd revealed how much practical knowledge American settlers had lost in their westward expansion. Knowledge that indigenous peoples and cold climate cultures had refined over centuries. The irony wasn't lost on frontier historians. European immigrants had dismissed Native American building techniques as primitive, while simultaneously freezing in their own cabins because they'd forgotten the physics those primitive peoples had mastered generations earlier. The Blackfeet, who'd inhabited Montana territory long before any homesteader arrived, elevated their sleeping areas in winter lodges using folded buffalo robes and wooden frames. They understood thermal stratification not through thermometers and measurements, but through observation, tradition, and the simple reality that people who sleep cold don't survive to pass on their methods. By the time Lars built his platform in 1881, this knowledge had been proven across continents and centuries. He was simply reintroducing information that American frontier culture had somehow excluded from its collective memory. The spread of elevated sleeping platforms through Montana territory represented something deeper than one man's cleverness. It represented the relearning of survival principles that should never have been forgotten. Thomas Bradley, who'd initially called Lars a fool, later wrote in his journal, "We brought Eastern building practices to Western conditions and wondered why they failed. We called ourselves pioneers, but refused to learn from people who'd pioneered these lands before us. Pride is expensive. Mine cost me 3 years of cold sleep and more firewood than I can calculate." By 1885, government surveyors documenting frontier architecture noted that elevated sleeping platforms had become standard practice in Montana territory cabins, with adoption rates exceeding 70% in regions where winter temperatures routinely dropped below zero. The design had evolved beyond Lars's original 7-foot platform to include variations for different cabin sizes, family structures, and building materials. Some innovations improved on the basic principle. German settlers developed combination platforms that served as sleeping areas at night and storage lofts during the day, accessible by removable ladders. Norwegian homesteaders built tiered platforms that accommodated multiple family members at different heights, creating thermal zones where parents slept highest, children slept mid-level, and storage occupied the coldest floor space. But the core insight remained unchanged. Vertical position determined survival in cold climate shelter. Modern applications of this principle exist in ways Lars would recognize. Cold weather mountaineering tents position sleeping bags on elevated platforms to escape ground cold. Arctic research stations use raised sleeping quarters. Off-grid tiny house designs incorporate loft sleeping areas not just to save floor space, but to capture rising heat from wood stoves below. The principle even influenced architectural practice. By the early 1900s, heating engineers were calculating thermal layering in their designs, recognizing that room temperature isn't a single number, but a vertical gradient. The discipline of building science would eventually codify what Lars demonstrated with his mercury thermometer. Heat distribution in enclosed spaces follows predictable physical laws that design must accommodate. Yet the knowledge remains fragile. Each generation of builders risks forgetting what previous generations learned through cold experience. Modern central heating systems mask thermal stratification by forcing air circulation, creating uniform temperatures that make vertical position irrelevant. People who've never slept in a single-room cabin with a wood stove have no intuitive understanding of where heat goes when left to physics rather than fans. This is what makes Lars Eriksson's story valuable beyond its historical setting. It's a reminder that traditional knowledge isn't quaint folklore. It's empirical engineering refined through generations of survival pressure. When we dismiss traditional practices as primitive or outdated, we often reveal our own ignorance about the problems those practices solved. The settlers who laughed at Lars's attic bed weren't stupid. They were confident in their existing knowledge and skeptical of methods that contradicted their assumptions. This is normal human psychology. What made Lars different wasn't superior intelligence, but his willingness to question assumptions and test alternatives when evidence suggested conventional wisdom might be wrong. The measurements he made on December 20th, 1881, 56 degrees of temperature difference in 7 feet of vertical space, destroyed comfortable certainties. They proved that sleeping near a fire isn't the same as sleeping warm. They proved that burning more wood doesn't necessarily create better results. They proved that efficiency comes from understanding physics, not from increasing effort. And they proved something more subtle, that humility toward traditional knowledge, whether from Swedish timber camps, Finnish loggers, Russian trappers, or indigenous peoples, isn't weakness. It's survival intelligence. By 1890, Lars Eriksson had become a local authority on cabin heating efficiency. Settlers consulted him on fireplace design, thermal mass, and platform construction. He never charged money for this advice, considering it communal knowledge that shouldn't be hoarded. When he died in 1904 at age 73, his obituary in the Helena Independent noted, "He taught us that sometimes the old ways aren't outdated, they're proven, and that pride freezes while humility stays warm." His original cabin stood until 1923, when it was dismantled to make way for a ranch house. The elevated sleeping platform was preserved and donated to the Montana Historical Society, where it remains today, a wooden frame 7 feet 3 inches long, 4 feet wide, with chalk marks showing its original position relative to floor and ceiling. Visitors who see it often ask the same question: did this really make that much difference? The answer is in the numbers Lars recorded. 68 degrees at platform level while floor level water froze solid. A 75% reduction in wood consumption while achieving warmer sleep. 17 cabins adopting the design within 4 months. 40 cabins within 6 months. Regional adoption within 4 years. Traditional knowledge doesn't always announce itself with authority. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carried by an immigrant who learned it from old men in a timber camp. Sometimes it's mocked before it's measured. And sometimes it takes deadly cold to prove that what we called foolishness was actually wisdom we'd forgotten. If this story taught you something about survival, engineering, or humility, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us what traditional knowledge from your own culture deserves more respect. Because the best innovations often aren't new ideas. They're old ideas that finally found people willing to listen. Lars Eriksson built a bed in his ceiling and changed frontier architecture. But his real legacy wasn't the platform. It was the principle that survival requires us to question our assumptions, measure our results, and remain humble before the accumulated wisdom of people who faced the same challenges in different times and places. They laughed when he climbed into his rafters. They stopped laughing when winter proved him right. And they built their own platforms when they realized that warmth doesn't come from proximity to fire. It comes from understanding where heat actually goes. In Montana Territory, 1881, that lesson cost a quarter cord of wood and the willingness to sleep 7 feet above the floor. The price of not learning, it was much higher. Frozen children, exhausted families, and winters spent fighting physics instead of working with it. Traditional knowledge isn't always right, but dismissing it without testing often reveals not their ignorance, but ours. Lars knew that. His neighbors learned it. And the elevated sleeping platforms they built became monuments to a simple truth, that the best survival technology often comes from paying attention to what cold climate peoples have known for centuries. Sleep high, where the warm air goes. It's not complicated. It's just physics. And in frontier Montana, physics kept people alive. Educational disclaimers. This content is historical educational. Modern building codes, fire safety regulations, and structural engineering standards must be followed for any contemporary construction. Consult licensed professionals before implementing historical building techniques.